Hello, and welcome to the Spoonie Authors Podcast, a podcast where we explore the life and stories of a different disabled author each week. I'm your host, Diana Gunn, and joining us today is Nicole Zelniker. Nicole Zelniker, her, is a writer, activist, and podcast producer at the Naciona. Nicole is also the author of Mixed, a nonfiction book about race and mixed race families, and Last Dance, a collection of short stories. You can check out the rest of her work at nicolezelniker.com. Hello, Nicole.
Hi, how are you?
I am great. I'm very excited to have you here to chat about your myriad of projects. And in particular, I'm excited to talk about your upcoming novel. So can you tell us a bit about Letters That I'll Never Send?
So I started it around January of this year, started really getting into it. I had some ideas before and then had written kind of some separate excerpts, but started putting them together earlier this year, doing some edits, and it's going to be published soon, date TBD with Atmosphere Press.
Awesome. And so Atmosphere Press is a small publisher?
Yeah, they're a small publisher. They had published my short stories previously, and they have a bunch of awesome books on their website. So
awesome. I'll have to check them out. I'm always on the lookout for a good new small publisher. Well, new to me.
Yeah. I think they're pretty young, so new would be fair.
Fair enough. So this is your first time writing a full-length novel. First of all, what inspired you to actually take on this challenge?
Yeah, it's something I've always wanted to do. It's been different, but also not. Just I think the way that I write is kind of short story-esque, like writing little bits and pieces, and then kind of seeing how it all came together. And Letters specifically has kind of a lot of different moving parts. There are, actual letters that the protagonist sends or doesn't send to people in her life as part of therapy and part of her healing. And the protagonist is also a writer, so there are excerpts from as she's kind of figuring out how to cope with what had happened to her, her own writing. So it wasn't so different in that way, but then also, just writing a longer connected piece was a challenge in and of itself, and maintaining the tone, maintaining the voice of the narrator and the other characters. So, yeah.
Awesome. So what was the most challenging part? Was it that challenge of maintaining tone, or?
I would say the most challenging part was figuring out what was missing. I think because I had previously largely written short stories, I'm kind of in the mindset of condensing, and with the novel, there needs to be more, and people, that there's space to answer the questions that people might have, that readers might have. So I think figuring out, what those questions might be and anticipating them before I would be able to be asked was the biggest challenge.
Oh boy, that's, yeah, I can see that being the biggest challenge. This sounds like, too, there was just a lot going on, both, like in the story and in the process.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, that's cool. So this is your first novel, but you've also written a bunch of short stories. I know you were in the anthology Nothing Without Us, which is a great anthology. We've actually interviewed both of the editors on here. And you also have your own anthology and a nonfiction book and a podcast. First of all, how do you manage to have time for all of this, all of these projects?
I think the OCD definitely helps. With that is, the kind of frantically needing to do everything all the time. So that's the answer. That that's kind of my mental health answer. But I mean, I think that it's, it's important to me, and definitely with, with the first two books, with the short stories and with the nonfiction, I was able to work on them um, with the nonfiction in grad school and with the short stories in undergrad. So that, making time in my adult life has been different, working on this. But um, I don't. Uh, I mean, I guess it's important to me, and I guess instead of watching Netflix, I'm writing a novel. um, so, and the last couple of months especially have been, I think it's been hard for a lot of people, um, just with the pandemic and everything that's been happening with the Black Lives Matter protests and, the upcoming election. And I think a lot of how I channel my stress is focusing on these projects. So, it's been a good time for editing for me.
Yeah, I was about to ask that because what I've found in my creative communities is that the pandemic has really got a lot of people stuck, like
Yeah,
really, really deeply creatively stuck.
for sure.
And I have other friends who've, written 3 books since they went into lockdown.
Yeah.
I seem to be going back and forth week by week. What's it been like for you? Has the pandemic had a big impact on your process or your schedule in terms of your creative work?
Yeah, I think it's definitely pushed me to focus on this more. And I think it has been sort of a distraction for me. It has really kind of bothered me when I see, people on social media or just post saying, because of the pandemic, we should all be writing, 4 novels and, learning a new language and doing all these skills. And, even though I've managed to write this, I don't think it's fair to put that on people. I think that this is, if the only thing you can do right now is survive, that's pretty awesome.
Absolutely. You might be at home, but it's not like you've been given just a casual
Yeah,
6-month vacation.
we are in the
Everything
middle of
is
a
upended.
pandemic.
Yeah, you're in the middle of a pandemic. Everything is upended. You
Mhm.
can't do the things you would normally do during time off. Like there's just this low level anxiety. It's
Yeah.
exhausting.
And I think with writing specifically, it's maybe people have writers groups that help them that they can't go to. Like it's not, I don't think it's fair to just say that everyone should be able to be the next Stephen King, because we have 6 months of being inside.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important perspective to keep in mind. And it's so sickening how much capitalism just pushes us to this
Mhm.
toxic idea of be productive at all times, no matter what your circumstances are.
For sure. Yeah. Especially, we're talking about, mental health and disability and physical, disability. And I mean, I think it's also just a really ableist idea that, we should always be productive all the time. People with depression and anxiety, that this hasn't helped, people that might have a physical disability that, doesn't allow them to do things the same way that someone who isn't physically disabled might be able to do. I think it's just, I think we need to normalize the idea of that it's okay to, not be productive all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So bringing things back to the art side of things,
Yeah.
we've talked about how you make time for it, but why is it so important to you to be working in all these different mediums rather than being hyper focused on, say, just novel writing?
Yeah. I think it's important to one is accessibility. Like with the podcast specifically, I started it with the Nashona, and it was based on my nonfiction book, which is about race and mixed race families. And we had talked about, how to get um, those stories out to the maximum amount of people. And, they're written down in this book, but then also, maybe it's easier for some people to listen to podcasts, or maybe people just prefer podcasts, and getting that out. Definitely my kind of main creative channel is writing. But it's also been really cool, to learn about podcasting. And I mean, you get it, this is your podcast, but it's been cool to learn how to do things in different mediums. And then, kind of second is that I think with learning these different skills, whether it's, podcasting or whatever kind of other mediums I've taken on, it's been helpful to kind of bring those skills back into writing. And yeah, I guess that's the answer to my question, and I'm gonna trail off awkwardly now.
Oh, that's all right.
It's a big mood for me.
Honestly, I love doing this podcast, especially when I'm doing interviews with other people who have anxiety, because there's just this camaraderie where we both just say silly things and sometimes trail off. I had a brain fart in the middle of one of my podcast interviews recently, and it's just this lovely understanding atmosphere that has been created with the Spoonie Authors Podcast that I'm really grateful for. And yeah, I think the coolest thing about writing is that everything informs our work.
Yeah.
Sure. There's, it may not be direct, but every piece of knowledge we gain, every piece of experience we gain, it can somehow be related back to writing.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that's, especially true with letters and working on that, is that, like, it's very, I mean, it's fiction, it's fictionalized, but a lot of it is based on my own life. The main character goes into a psych hospital at the very beginning, and is like learning how to deal with depression and anxiety, and that's very much based on my own experiences. I went into an inpatient facility when I was 14. For almost a week, and very different than the 8 months that the central character spends there, but definitely like pulled from my own experiences. And it's definitely been cathartic in a lot of ways. And then also just I'm excited to just have those conversations with people, and have some part in normalizing things like depression and anxiety and mental illness.
Yeah, I think it's really important to have those stories out there, and frankly that it's a lot easier to tell a fictionalized version of it than to actually spill your guts about your own.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, I don't even like writing in this world. I'm like, nah, that's way too close to my own personal experience.
Yeah, well, I've experimented with kind of like fantasy and dystopia and stuff, never published, but I think the hardest thing for me is, world creation. So if that's what you do, kudos to you.
Well, thank you. So, and this is a contemporary work, I'm assuming?
Mm-hmm.
Have you dealt with the pandemic in your work? Have you included that? Because I know that's something that a lot of contemporary authors have struggled with the decision around. Do we even mention it?
Have not. I think I would be open to it. I think right now I know a lot of what I need to read is not about the pandemic, when it comes to fiction and when it comes to just leisure reading. So I think that, I want to put out there what I would be interested in reading, because hopefully there are other people that would be interested in it as well. Maybe when I get a little bit of distance from the pandemic, which doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon, but maybe then.
Fair enough. I think it's an interesting thing to wrestle with, how do you write contemporary when the contemporary world is kind of on fire in like 8 different ways.
For sure. I've talked to people about writing dystopia, and it just seems like the market for that right now is rather small.
Yeah.
Because we're living in it. So yeah.
Yeah, it's like I have a copy of The Road that I've been meaning to read forever. And I don't, at this point, I don't know what's ever going to happen.
Yeah. I have a friend's mom who's a professor who is putting together like a pandemic reading list. And I'm like, all I want to do is read Harry Potter and, things that are not about the pandemic right now. Even though there are plenty of good books out there about, pandemic and dystopia, but
Yeah, I'm still reading dark books, but
yeah.
I'm sticking firmly in the fantasy realm. I haven't read a science fiction book or a contemporary book of any kind in a long time. And
Yeah.
honestly, it'll probably be however long it is until we get a vaccine before I do,
Oof.
really. I'm just...
Yeah, for sure.
Anyway, bringing things back to the disability a bit.
Mm-hmm.
So, what advice would you give to authors who want to include disabled characters, and especially authors who want to include representation of mental illness in their work?
Yeah, I would say that it's a balance between, they have lives outside of being disabled, and also that it does affect them. So, writing a character like with the main character in Letters, not that I'm the shining example or anything, and I can only really offer what I've done, but what I tried to do was, this is something that obviously is very is affecting her, especially over the course of the novel, but then also she has relationships with friends and her wife and her daughter and other people in her life in her life, and she is someone who has depression, but she's also a writer, and I think making it clear that she isn't depression was important to me. But then also, making it clear that, well, at the same time, this is something that very is very important for her to focus on right now. So I think it's about finding that balance.
Yeah, absolutely. Though I must say, some days with some of the conversations I have, it seems like her being depressed and her being a writer might just be synonymous.
Yeah. I don't think I've ever met a sane writer, which, is a big mood.
I've met recovered writers who have, put in like 20, 30 years of trauma work.
Yeah, for sure.
But most of the writers I know have, they have that deep emotional wound that they give their characters all the time.
Yeah. I was talking about this with a writer friend the other day, that, how much of our characters are just us projecting trauma onto, this page. And I said probably a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It varies from one writer to the next, but
for sure.
a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's a bad thing, though. I mean, I think that, it's a human experience, and for me, like, I mean, I said before, it's been really cathartic, and I've written essays and short stories about mental health in the past that I've had people reach out and say, hey, I've gone through something similar, and I didn't know of anyone that had gone through this openly, and it's really cool to see that I'm not alone, or hey, just that story I read really helped me kind of work through some things, and that's been really cool for me, is seeing that I've been able to connect with people that way.
Yeah, and that's one of the really cool things about fiction. That's one of the things I love most about it, is that, yeah, it's cathartic for us as we write it, but if we do it right, we can also reach across the table and give a similarly cathartic experience to our readers, or our watchers, the people who are experiencing our stories. I have been watching through the show Killjoys, which is like the most underrated sci-fi show ever, and I'm kind of just on a quest to get everyone to watch it. And it just has the most powerful and healing representations of trauma I've seen in really any like TV show. I've seen this kind of powerful representation in books, but for TV it goes above and beyond. The whole series is out, so you don't have to worry about not getting an ending. Um, and
Love that.
unfortunately, it's only on Netflix in the UK. I don't know why. It's a Canadian show,
Fascinating.
but yeah. Anyway,
I'm very
I
like one track mind with TV shows. Like I can only manage to watch one at a time. So right now it's Pose, and I will only watch Pose.
fair enough. I think, that's important because there's only so much time in a day. If you want to have 8 different creative projects, you gotta
I think it's
limit that
also
to
just,
time.
I know I'm gonna get so invested in the characters. There's only so much emotional capacity I have to get invested in these fictional people.
Yeah. Using so much emotional capacity for other things, including my own fictional people. I've only got so much for other people's fictional people.
Uh-huh. Gotta strike that balance somehow.
Yeah. All right. So that brings us to our final question, which is where can people go to find out more about you and your work?
Yeah, so I do have a website. It's nicolezelniker.com. I also, because I've done podcasts with Dinesh, and I have some stuff published there. And both of my books are on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, so you should totally check them out. They're great,
Awesome.
says my mom.
And well, if she didn't, she wouldn't be a good mom.
There you go. One way of looking at it.
It's a mom's job to be supportive.
Mm-hmm.
I know, unfortunately, too many people whose mothers don't really understand that, but
For sure. I don't think she understands a lot of what I write, but she supports it. So,
well, that's the important thing.
uh-huh.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Have a lovely day and good luck surviving 2020.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Spoonie Authors Podcast. The Spoonie Authors Podcast is part of the Spoonie Authors Network, a community initiative devoted to sharing the stories of disabled authors and educating abled people about what life is like for disabled creatives. Transcripts of this podcast are also available on the Spoonie Authors Network. To learn more or become a contributor, visit spoonieauthorsnetwork.blog. And of course, if you enjoyed this podcast, make sure to leave a 5-star review on your favorite podcast streaming platform.